Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Penitentiary punishment, 19 years in Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. To most of us, prisons seem especially dangerous places. In 1981 alone, over 100 inmates were killed in U.S. prisons. Countless riots occur. Between the 1971 riot at Attica in New York and the riot in the New Mexico State Prison in 1980, 39 major prison riots took place. The New Mexico riot was the most brutal in U.S. history. 33 inmates were killed by other prisoners, many after being tortured and mutilated. Hundreds more were wounded. These chilling facts may lead us to think that all prisons are alike, but they are not. Some are safe, some violent. Some are grim fortresses, some look like college campuses. Some are run by the guards alone, some are run in part by the prisoners themselves. How best to manage prisons has become a burning issue. Some wardens think that a strict military model is best. Others call for inmate councils and the extension of prisoner rights. Increasingly, federal judges are deciding these matters. Whether they are deciding them correctly is much in dispute. That dispute is evident in the recent history of Texas prisons.
You talk to prisoners that have done time in Texas. There are deep scars, bitterness, hatred, great deal of racism. Just treated like dogs, and they'll tell you that. Just beat down.
System worked. It was cheap, protected people. It educated them. Three things that are hard for prison systems to do, it did them.
For years, the Texas prison system was considered one of the best in the country. Prisons were clean, orderly, and efficient. The management philosophy was based on hard work and strict discipline. Inmates wore white uniforms and marched in straight lines along the walls.
The place was safe and clean, and I mean safe and clean for both the kept and the keeper.
Prison order was maintained by inmates known as building tenders, who were chosen by prison officials to supervise other inmates.
The building tender was an element of a positive peer group pressure. And this is the secret in running a disciplined and humane prison.
Not everyone considered the system humane. In the mid-1970s, inmates joined in a lawsuit against the Texas prison system and its director, Jim Estelle. They told of inmates dispensing medication and operating on one another, of having mail censored and being denied access to attorneys, and of brutal beatings by the building tenders.
They would let them building tenders do what they want, you know, and there would be 5 or 6 of them on one guy, you know. It stunk. That was the bottom line.
In 1980, a federal judge ordered drastic changes in the way the prisons were run. He enlarged the scope of prisoners' rights and ruled that inmates could not be used as building tenders. Many believe the prisons have been out of control ever since.
Much of the order's gone. And in the prisons today, you've got 10 to 15% of the prisoners who cannot be controlled by the existing disciplinary methods. They break windows in their cells, they tear out commodes, they assault guards, they throw their food onto the floors in front of the cells. They behave like destructive machines.
If you could look back through the records 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was very few inmate-on-inmate assaults with weapons. And assault of a correctional officer was unheard of. It's not uncommon for me to get anywhere between 5 and 7 correctional officers or more a week assaulted here.
In 1984, 25 inmates were murdered in Texas prisons. Over 400 were stabbed and more than 1,000 guards assaulted. Additional guards were hired to replace the building tenders, but violence erupted when inmates and prison gangs vied for the control once held by building tenders.
Today there are convicts who will kill you in the prisons. There may have always been convicts, building tenders, who would beat you up. Today there are convicts who will kill you over extortion, over gang questions.
Now we're seeing the reporting of violence, and it seems like there's a lot more. But talking to people in the system and ex-prisoners and their families, they just said there were always a lot of stabbings, but they just weren't publicized.
Those who support the court-ordered changes say the current violence is part of a difficult transition period that will eventually produce safer, more humane prisons.
I think the system's changing. I think Texas is at a crossroads that we could end up with a very good prison system.
If I had my choice, I'd take it like it is now, and far worse in this regard. I would rather worry about a personal problem with a group of people or a person than with the man. Because at least there, I feel like I'm on at least semi-even ground. You know, if I'm bucking a building tender back then, I'm bucking the whole system. And I got a no-win situation, and I cannot win.
There was a certain amount of brutality. I wouldn't deny that, and I don't think anybody in the system would. You can't have any inmate in authority over another and not have some abuses of that. We still, the only difference now is we don't hire building tenders. The inmates still exhibit authority over the others by the pecking order. Whoever's strong survives. So rather than having those inmates work for the administration, they're working for themselves now.
Here to discuss these issues with us are Dr. George Beto, professor at Sam Houston State University, Alvin Bronstein, executive director of the National Prison Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Norval Morris, professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Dr. Beto, until 1972, you were the director of the Texas Department of Corrections. How exactly did the building tender system work, and how did it fit into your philosophy of management at that time?
We didn't consider them inmate or prison guards. I looked at them more as institutionalized snitches, informants, and glorified porters. Occasionally, a mistake could be made in the selection of a building tender, just as mistakes could be made in hiring an employee. However, the routine or the procedure for stipulating that any prisoner serve as a building tender was complex. No single warden had the authority to appoint a prisoner a building tender. His recommendation had to be approved by the director of classification. Whether or not subsequent to my administration the system was abused, that wardens were given too much authority and subsequently building tenders were given too much authority, I don't know. However, the system worked, and it worked without brutality.
Let me ask you what happened. The system, in the testimony of many persons, is not working today. What in general terms changed?
I don't know what changed. Obviously, there's been a loss of control. In the many years that I was there, I, as you indicated earlier in the introduction, emphasized discipline and emphasized work, and there was a third ingredient in that administrative model, and that was education. Most of these prisoners are either poor or stupid or inept. They come from extremely permissive environments. Large numbers are living in the congregate. And wherever people live in the congregate, whether it's a Boy Scout camp or a college dormitory or an Army barracks, it's imperative that you have regulations, that behavior be controlled. So we had discipline. The prudent use of the carrot and the stick, the loss of good time, the giving of good time, the movement from a less choice assignment to a more choice assignment. And we tried to make our work day, whether it was in industry or whether it was in agriculture, approximate the type of work day that you had in the free world. It wasn't artificial work. And finally, there was an extremely heavy emphasis on education. I don't think there's a prison in America that had that emphasis on education.
Did the change that occurred to the present more disorderly state, did that precede the intervention of federal judges? Has the intervention of federal judges made matters better or made matters worse?
Hard for me to say. If I can comment on the order, Judge Justice's order, especially after the Fifth Circuit voided a part of it and remanded a part for rehearing, is not an order with which a prison administrator is unable to live. What has complicated the situation in Texas is that, to my knowledge, at least a dozen consent agreements have been signed by the defendants' attorneys, the attorneys representing the state of Texas, and the plaintiffs' attorneys, which consent agreements are much more restrictive than Judge Justice's original order.
Let me turn to Al Bronstein for a moment. You have been involved in bringing suit on behalf of prisoners around the country. What do you think went wrong in Texas?
Well, my problem is that I thought the Texas system prior to the federal court order was one of the worst in the country. What happened since the order are two things. One is you change from a system of prisoner control over prisoners to ostensibly staff control, and that's predictably to be a time of disorder. Secondly, the talk about the disorder and the great deal of violence now after the court order is a little off pace. You had just as much violence before, it just wasn't reported. It was officially sanctioned violence by building tenants, by guards. There were no records kept of it. So there really hasn't been that great amount of change.
Let me just to clarify one point there. One can understand how records of assaults may or may not be accurate, but would it be fair to say that in the past there were as many inmates actually killed as there are today?
No, and unfortunately the killing rate has gone up dramatically, and that's, I think, a direct result of what my good friend George Beto described as the institutional snitch. You cannot run a prison system, it seems to me, in this country based on a system of informers, because the moment you lose a little control of that, those informers are going to be killed. That's what the New Mexico riot was about. That's who was killed in New Mexico. It seems to me that if you run a system out of repression, fear, and pressure, you use snitches, the moment you ease some of those pressures, those people are going to get killed, and that's what's happened in Texas.
Is there really a feasible alternative to using prisoners, inmates themselves, to help control other inmates? The guards are outnumbered by 5 or 10 or 20 to 1. Can the guards really run the prisons without the aid of the inmates?
Oh, sure, and they do it all over this country in other prisons. If you run a system based on justice, on fairness, you involve prisoners in some, not security concerns, but in some of the program concerns, you treat them with a certain amount of dignity and humanity, you'll have a safe prison.
Mr. Beto, do you think that that is the right prescription to having a safe prison, having the prisoners participate more, let the guards make the decisions, and have a justice be the essential principle?
Well, I'd have to agree that justice has to be the prevailing principle. If I didn't believe that, it'd be analogous to being opposed to motherhood and God and apple pie. I don't agree with Al on his statement that there was violence there before it wasn't reported. That's not true.
That's what Judge Justice found in the court records, and that's what the decision says. Massive amounts of brutality, those are the words in the court order. Massive amounts of violence, massive amounts of suicide and self-mutilations. That's what the record shows.
Well, I don't believe his order says specifically that, but I'm willing to let a prisoner have as much latitude in governing his life as he'll let me give him. I come back to the point that I have an obligation as a prison administrator to protect that man. Society obviously has the right to lock a man up, but society also has an overriding obligation to protect anyone who is locked up. And only with a certain amount of control can that protection be afforded.
Norval, do you see a fundamental difference between George Beto and Al Bronstein in these matters?
Well, I think there's a longer history of trusting prisoners to run prisons, which I don't think we'll go back to. And I think it's thinking about the past to think about questions whether the Texas will go back to that. I think it won't. But I think there's another common problem that lies behind this. These places run by consent. Your point is right. The prisoners always outnumber the staff, and they always have immediate control. So to that extent, there's consent that operates. But you've also got to know what's going on in the institution. And I think out of those two constraints comes another value that hasn't been mentioned. I really think to make minimally decent prisons, you've got to make relatively small prisons. I've not been to a big prison anywhere in the world that I thought could be well run, mainly for the reasons that lay behind those discussions.
Do you agree that a big prison can't be run as well as a small prison? Certainly the Texas compounds are among the largest prisons in the world.
I don't like to see a prison exceed 2,000 in number, and I know Norval will recoil at that.
I did.
He just recoiled.
I don't think there's any documentary evidence that the Canadian prescription that the number not exceed 200, or that we shouldn't have 500, more than 500, as American Correctional Association maintains, is necessarily the ideal. I've failed to see the documentary evidence, the empirical evidence. I think it all depends on how you administer it. And Norval alluded a moment to this idea of communicating with inmates. I think one of the problems in American prisons is not a sufficient amount of communication on the part of the administrators, and by administrators I'm talking about wardens and directors and commissioners of corrections, with the prisoners. And I think many of these problems that we have today stem from the fact that the wardens and the commissioners don't know what's going on in the institutions.
Part of that is relative to size. How do they know 4,000 prisoners?
Excuse me. Let me turn to another chapter in this continuing episode, because there is a search underway for a more effective way to manage prisons. One promising effort is in Butner, North Carolina. This is not a typical prison. The barbed wire and double fence are barely visible from inside the Federal Correctional Institution at Butner, North Carolina. Inmates carry keys to their own private rooms, wear their own clothes, and walk freely about the grounds during the day.
It's very unusual. And it's just like walking on a college campus. I mean, from the outside, the different units look like college campuses to me, dormitory units. So that's pretty much what it felt like to me. I mean, it's not like it's a correctional institution unless you look at the wire.
There are three distinct groups of prisoners at Butner: the mentally ill, those sentenced to Butner by the courts, and a research population. Butner was designed in part to study the effects of a less structured prison environment on young, violent convicts.
66% of the inmates here have been convicted of crimes against people, robbery, homicide, and so forth. We have more than 80% are doing over 5 years, and about 70% are doing more than 10 years. So we have a population here of people who've committed pretty serious crimes and who are doing sizable periods of sentences.
Inmates in the research group are randomly selected by computer and sent to Butner from other federal institutions. Once here, they are given the date they'll be released from prison if there are no behavioral problems. They are faced with unusual decisions and responsibilities. After their first 60 days, they have a choice: return to their former prison or stay at Butner. 90% choose to stay. Then they must decide whether to participate in any of the 22 educational, vocational, and self-improvement programs, or simply wait for their release. Though programs are voluntary, every prisoner is required to work, and it's up to him to get to the job on time. Butner is experimental and more expensive than the average prison. Both staff and inmates, however, say it's worth it.
At penitentiaries in different places that aren't set up like this, you always have to, there's a code, penitentiary code that you live by, and there's no interaction with staff, not that much interaction with the other inmates, and you kind of have to watch your back. You can feel tension in the air. But here, We don't have any assaults. We don't have any stabbings. We don't have any killings. The atmosphere is more relaxed.
We have taken people who have generally been problems in other institutions, and even comparing these people against their security level counterparts, it's much safer here than it is anyplace else.
There have been no homicides and relatively few assaults at Butner since it opened in 1976. Butner's effect on prisoners once they leave, however, is unclear. Once released, these inmates commit just as many crimes as those released from other prisons.
What we found is that the inmates who have come to Butner and who've been in the research portion of our program, they get arrested at about the same percentage as the inmates who are in the control group. We have found that the period of time before rearrest is longer, and we've also found that the employability of these people has been better than those in the control group.
Norval Morris, you have been deeply involved in watching and helping Butner's experiment grow. What, in your judgment, is the key to its apparent success in maintaining order and safety?
Lots of elements coming together. Let me mention quickly the headings that I put there. I think voluntary programming is very important. You saw what he said. You can be involved in programs if you want to, but you don't have to. You've got to work, but you needn't be in programs. In the result, I think more people are in programs there than elsewhere. People know, by and large, what they want to do better when they decide than when you tell them. Fixed release dates, subject to good behavior.
That means you know when you're going to get out when you go in?
Yeah. And there's no play acting, so that you can use this period if you wish to, and you needn't if you don't wish to. The provision of a safe environment. You don't have to prove you're tough or a hero, so that people do feel safe. I know that they do feel safe when they're there. I think the thing that wasn't mentioned in the clip there, the presence of a substantial number of women front-of-the-line guards in a men's deep-end prison is important.
Why is that important?
I think they soften the atmosphere, they behave better, men in the presence of women. They do not get into any more danger. You get rid of this John Wayne macho nonsense that characterizes so much of our prisons. The expectations from the beginning have been and remain that people will remain reasonably, behave decently, including behave decently to a group of about 150 psychotic prisoners who also are mixed in for work, recreation, education.
They're not segregated for during their daily lives?
No.
What about the size of the prison population? How big is it?
About 420 reached its maximum.
And how much does it cost per prisoner there as compared to conventional federal prisons?
I hope I'm right about this. I'm not sure about the figures. Firstly, it's difficult to judge because of the 420, 150 are in what is a psychiatric prison, and of course that's more expensive and costs get mixed in. The best figure I saw was about 22,500. I'm not sure if that's up to date, per prisoner a year.
And that is the cost there compared to what might be the average?
It's a little above the average. Can you help me with that?
I think the cost there is higher now because the average in the federal system is about 20,000 at their other institutions, and I think it's probably about 28 at Butner.
But I was trying to correct for the psychiatric element, and I thought there, once you get rid of that lot and look at the rest, there was something, well, between the 20 and 25.
The key question is, to all three of you gentlemen, what lessons, if any, can we learn from Butler that might be applicable to other institutions? Are there lessons, Dr. Beto, that you think can be derived from Butner to how to manage prisons in Texas or elsewhere?
Oh, I think a number of lessons, or at least implications in the Butner experiment. It's my opinion we have a large number of people in prison who shouldn't be there. And I think that we can operate some more relaxed prisons, and we do. We can't do it for everybody. You've got to remember that this is a group taken out of the total count of roughly 34,000 in the Federal Bureau of Prisons today.
But this is a tough group.
This is a deep end of the prison.
This is a deep end group, not a soft group. This is tougher than the average group in any Texas prison.
In doing the planning for this place, I was doing planning not for a federal institution, but for a state institution, and I would like it to be tested for the inner city minority black population that disproportionately makes up our.
Let me ask you this question. Many people looking at Butner and noticing that it looks like a college campus or the office building of a prosperous insurance company may say, I am living in the inner city in a public housing project that is far worse than that prison. Why shouldn't I want to break into prison? Many people might think that prisoners at Butner are being treated too well. What reaction might you have?
Personally, I've been working in this field for a long while. I haven't met anyone yet who didn't want to leave.
Yes.
And I regard that as largely fiction, that people want to go in.
I think the first thing you have to keep in mind, Jim, that these people are being punished. They are being deprived of liberty, and that is substantial punishment in our society. If we wanted them to come back without being, horrors, then we have to treat them humanely and decently and keep them busy at all times. And that's what Butner does. It keeps them busy. It gives them some ability to participate in decisions affecting their own lives. And that's why it's a safe, secure place.
I gave the reaction of somebody who thought it might be too soft. Now let me give you the reaction of the opposite person. The opposite person would say, if this works so well, why isn't it being done everywhere? What is the reason why we don't have lots more Butners and lots fewer other kinds of institutions?
Well, because we still have a mentality in this country that places have to run that are punitive, they have to be massively controlled, they have to have informers and snitches. This takes education, and I think the Butner experiment is spreading. There are other places like that in this country.
Is that your reason?
Well, Rochester has been opened recently, which is an exact duplicate. It's being emulated in other countries. I don't think there's anything particularly original about Butner. I think the fact of the matter is that the prison administrators of America know how to run safe, small, decent prisons for the deepest end.
Dr. Beto, what would happen in Texas if someone came to the legislature and said, let us build in Texas a series of Butners? What do you think their reaction would be, knowing the costs and knowing the results? Do you think they would approve it?
No, I don't believe that they would.
Why not?
Prisons aren't that popular in any legislature, and it's relatively or comparatively difficult to secure funds.
Well, that assumes you have to build. I mean, you could build a dozen Butners on the grounds of one of the Texas prison systems with just a small amount of capital investment, by breaking them down to small units, which is what Judge Justice wanted done. So you wouldn't have to build new prisons. You've got more than enough prison space in Texas to take care of the people that need to be confined.
Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. For Crime File, I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.